love to now invite the next and final task force group to present with the title of their report, We All Live on Indigenous Land.
We all live on Indigenous land and have the responsibility to know our history.
Canada will welcome 1.2 million new residents by 2023.
Yet newcomers have very few opportunities to learn about Indigenous peoples' cultures and lived experiences.
Back in the early 2000s, an elder said, it's a real problem. People who come here, they still don't learn about whose land this is or the histories and current realities. Wouldn't that be amazing if we could bring people together, newcomers and settlers and immigrants, everybody who's not Indigenous to these lands, to learn and share and just really get to understand.
We have to understand Canada's history, especially if it's a dark one. If we're not learning about it and we're not helping to solve it, then we're part of the problem.
Community organizations across Canada are building relationships, but more needs to be done.
A lack of coordinated effort is no longer acceptable. Governments, settlement services, newcomers,
and all Canadians have a role to play in building trusted relationships.
We will only find peace when the other side of the equation begin to understand what reconciliation means and that we have to be all in it together. It's we, the people, that have to change this world.
To learn more, read the full report. We all live on Indigenous land, building trusted relationships in Canada's immigration process.
My name is Jenny. I'm here with my colleagues, Laura, Caitlin, Grace, Amrit, John, and our mentor, Daniel Jean. We want to acknowledge that we're speaking from unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe First Nations. And thank you so much, Sheldon, for your welcome and bringing us into this room in the right way. We want to give thanks to those who have stewarded the lands and waters for tens of thousands of years so that we can be here today. And we are a group of second generation immigrants, fourth and fifth generation settlers and newcomers coming across territories from across Turtle Island. In May 2021, the world learned of 215 unmarked graves discovered on a former Indian residential school in the Tk'emlúps Secwépemc First Nations. 1,000 more unmarked graves would be discovered throughout Canada, exposing an undeniable history and a national tragedy. Our group was compelled to ask what it means to be Canadian because immigration and truth and history cannot be separated. So we're giving a record of what we've learned today, and we're here to tell you what we've heard from communities. We spoke with elders, Indigenous leadership, newcomers, conducted 30 interviews, and engaged a reviewer council of Indigenous and newcomer experts, and we are grateful for their guidance. So today we'll explore how newcomers learn about Indigenous peoples, we'll highlight the important work that's already happening on the ground, and will provide policy recommendations to enhance newcomers' understanding of Canada's truth and history.
For years, newcomers' understanding of Canada's truth and history has been highlighted as an area where action is needed. From the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in 1996 to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015, Indigenous leaders have called the government to act. Updating the Oath of Citizenship and its study guide has been the response. Mais que ça, c'est suffisant? When most immigrants only go through this process after 9 years or 5 years of being in the country. and the remaining 40% never go through this process or do so after 10 years. Nous avons mené une enquête auprès des nouveaux arrivants qui a souligné le manque de connaissances et démontré le rôle des services d'établissement. Only 15% of those respondents were aware of Indigenous issues before arrival, and only 11% considered that their knowledge increased after arrival, even though 80% engaged with settlement services. But 30% mentioned that these agencies supported the increase of knowledge.
Through our interviews and survey, we learned that while the TRC calls to action are a good starting point, they focus on the citizenship portion of an immigrant's journey, leaving 5 to 10 years of missed opportunities to build trusted relationships between Indigenous peoples and newcomers. Many newcomers share cultural similarities and experiences with Indigenous peoples and can empathize with their circumstances. Newcomers from colonized lands have suffered intergenerational trauma and displacement, and refugees especially can relate to these traumatic experiences and offer a unique point of allyship. Art can be used as a means of intercultural exchange and learning, as shown through the Cultivating Canada report in 2011. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is fundamental, and corresponding Canadian legislation is fundamentally changing how we think and practice meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities. As governments work to align their legislation and programming with the principles of UNDRIP, we can move forward in this process. We also learn from organizations leading the way in creating educational resources and space to build relationships between newcomers and Indigenous peoples across Canada.
So naturally, our group was wondering, what's out there? What are some case studies and best practices? Au cours des 6 derniers mois, nous avons l'occasion d'explorer quelques exemples à travers du Canada. In the Yukon and Whitehorse, we had the opportunity to speak with many community leaders, including Marius Cortenu, who I see on the line. Thank you, Marius, Director of the Yukon Immigration Office, who shared with us, in partnership with Yukon University, they created a 101 course, which is a requirement for all newcomers arriving in the Yukon to learn about First Nations. It's a course online available, mandatory, and you learn about the history and the culture. We also learned in the city of Vancouver from community leaders like Camilla Todd and Corey Wilson, visionaries in filmmaking, in sharing their narrative, and they saw a gap in Vancouver where they helped to create a newcomer film and also the first newcomer's guide that shared about the First Nations people in Vancouver. This is the most comprehensive newcomer's guide on First Nations that has been done, and it's been replicated in other cities. We also listened to community leader Anela Lee in Calgary, who is the CEO of the Center for Newcomers, who, inspired by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, thought it was her responsibility as the CEO of a settlement service to bridge the communities between the Indigenous community and newcomers, and using IRCC funding, helped to facilitate community exchange, a community kitchen food recipe exchange between the two groups. And that was her own way of contributing. Et finalement, à Montréal, nous avons discuté avec Abdullah Doud, cofondateur de Centre pour réfugiés. Et Abdullah avait créé un site web appelé Allo Canada pour centraliser les informations sur l'histoire des peuples autochtones. In all these case studies, we really saw it was really visionary leadership, innovation, and really a commitment to take action.
So, a review on relevant case studies, our survey findings, and our collaborative interviews led to the formation of goals to enhance uptake of Indigenous learning. Our first two goals, number 1, center Indigenous peoples and histories in agencies through training, technology, and inclusion. And number 2, increase Indigenous participation and understanding within immigration policymaking. These are aimed for agencies such as settlement services, immigration departments, and the federal government. In the Yukon, particularly with the government and local settlement services, we saw successful implementation of Indigenous training and education for employees and newcomers. This was done by utilizing resources that are created by Indigenous peoples and hiring Indigenous peoples to help with daily operations. Committing to these goals require a clear mandate by all agencies. For instance, a systemic update and understanding of UNDRIP to align with future legislations across this country. It's clear we need to change how and whom these resources are prepared by and how they're integrated into these existing agencies.
The next goal is to enhance newcomer education on Indigenous histories, cultures, and lived experiences. The federal and provincial governments can support by finalizing an updated citizenship guide and create a way for newcomers to provide feedback for future revisions. They can also create a centralized First Peoples guide for newcomers that can be used across the country, including or much like the guides that exist in Vancouver and Manitoba. The next goal is to increase Indigenous awareness in settlement services. Embedding more Indigenous content in language classes would be an effective means of learning and is very common in these agencies across the country. Also, establishing a conference for these agencies would go a long way in connecting the great work that is already happening. And lastly, enhancing Indigenous awareness through community engagement and self-learning was our last goal. Individuals and communities can learn the traditional territories they live on, attend local Indigenous celebrations, support Indigenous business, and read important documents such as UNDRIP, the TRC calls to action, and the National Inquiry of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. So this is a very brief summary of our report that focuses on building trusted relationships for the future. We all live on Indigenous land and have a role to play.
And so much of what we've learned over the last 10 months that we've learned about allyship is can be uncomfortable. And we recognize that this means that this is where we need to focus. And so we just welcome conversation and walk along aside each other in the next little while for conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much.